Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to join this conversation at this point in time. It's quite timely, a conversation on women and elections, especially from where I come from. We've just come out in Uganda from a week of internet blackout during our elections, which were held on the 14th. Amidst a pandemic, it's one of the elections being held in a pandemic. So this is quite an important question, and the question really varies from where you are and what kind of place in terms of transition to democracy or democracy that your country is at. So I would, getting into this conversation, I would have been interested to hear reflections on the context within which people live, because you can't really, you can have similarities and differences, but people where they come from, where do their experience come from, where are they rooted in the experiences of the women in their locality with the elections. I would have liked to hear that, and that's why I've started with my background being in Uganda. We've come from one of the worst election marred by violence in our history. We still have a president on after 35 years. He's just been announced to add on his 5 more years. So as you can imagine, my morale is quite low. I would have liked to hear what else is happening in other parts of the world, to be honest, and on this subject. We saw a lot of anti-establishment moves by young people. So I'm interested in what young women are doing, because most of the, especially African continent, is young women, yet their voices are never on the table. Or in countries where you think you've had a move and we have constitutions that are held, still we see that women in elections, where young women are still not featuring in elections. They're seen as some people who have to appear on affirmative action. So we see a kind of really sinister moves in different countries to use affirmative action as if the place of a woman in elections in our countries only belongs to affirmative action. And that bothers me, because I wouldn't want to be on affirmative action ticket, even when I recognize the need for affirmative action. But for you as a woman or a young woman to be involved in an election not on affirmative action, you'll be seen as, encroaching on men's territory. So how are we planning? What are different countries' approaches to bring young women into the arena of politics, the mainstream, not playing on the side, not playing on only affirmative action? Say affirmative action is the bare minimum. Women need more. Women need to be seen as equal partners on the public affairs stage, on the governance stage, not just appointed, but actually shifting the mindsets of our people, that they can see women as equals, not women as given a token appointment, a token seat, which is an affirmative action seat. So I would have liked to hear experiences on that. Away from participation and how women participating, I would have wanted to know, because currently we have a challenge on monetization of elections. So it's like, without money, you can make it. So that means that you kind of have elections that only feed the top class. So the top class of society, the ruling class, has control over means of production and markets in our countries. So they are able to buy elections. And if they can't do it themselves, then they hire somebody, even if they are from your class, to be representative of their interests. How do we overcome capitalism in our elections? How do elections make sense? Because without kicking out this aspect of capitalism, you cannot bring out marginalized voices. So I can't imagine a young person, a young woman, a young queer person in a part of Africa running for an election and they are respected. And because they come from very many marginalizations in terms of how people are seen or who is seen to be a leader, but also who has access to money. These are marginalized groups. So when women don't have that much access to money in our countries, I would have wanted to hear this navigation around organizing, and this, the answer really lies in organizing, in how women are organizing together to reject the status quo of the capitalism system that has been presented via these elections. The other challenge I would have wanted to hear about is the actual stories of women who have gone into politics. As a journalist in Uganda and in different political processes that I've covered in the region of Eastern Africa, I have met so many grim stories of young people, young women, and older women who have been in power, and the amount of sexual harassment, the amount of sexual violence women go through in these corridors of power is unimaginable. So when we assume sexual violence that we have seen over years with movements like the Me Too movement, we rarely imagine a woman in a position of power being harassed. So that kind of shields away the concern of actually how sexual violence works in our societies. But women in elections, we can't run away from how violent, from physical to sexual violence to rhetoric, hate speech, misogyny, that mars most of our elections. And then follows women in politics once they are elected. So the issue isn't just when they are seeking to be elected, but after, even when they get in office, what kind of support do we need to put there? What kind of centers do we need that can follow up once women are elected? Because we put in women who are good and then they find the place really muddy and they go out and we don't see them ever again. So how do we sustain the momentum? I would have liked to hear that. So sexual violence and other forms of violence against women concern me, and I would have wanted to hear different contexts. How do we organize around this? How do we support women in politics? How do we know that they are not left alone because you're putting women in an establishment that was not meant for women? Let's remember, most of our former colonized societies, women were not expected to be at the heart of public affairs. Even when we had pre-colonial times where women actually could have certain representations and a voice. So colonialism, which was white patriarchy, basically took back a lot of the, certain aspects of representation, what representation looked like in our societies, and installed it with a male gaze and a male visibility in our politics, male power. So when you're a woman in politics, you can't run away from the fact that you are enrolling into a society, in an establishment that was not meant for you. So therefore, the terrain there is going to be rough. So I think it's very important to then look for ways to support different women. One example I would share was in Uganda. A woman MP recently lost her election because 2 years ago, she actually filed a court case against a criminal case against a young man who was like 24 years, who was sexually harassing her. And the whole country, plus the media, could not present her story as a genuine story of sexual harassment and bullying and cyberbullying. The government, it was a criminal matter, so the government took on the case. So this case of Honorable Sylvia Rwabogo took on a greater part of the year, and she went through a lot because it took her a lot. She was worried for her life. First of all, she kept quiet for over 8 months when this messaging was happening, until an MP was killed. She thought maybe somebody wants to kill me, and she came to the police with this case. So it turns out a case of harassment, sexual harassment, cyberbullying. It was there, but then it cost her an election. People said, "Oh, you were fighting a young man because he sent you love messages," and that's how the media framed her story. So I'm worried, and I would be interested in understanding how we can change media dynamics and narratives around covering women in power and women in political elective politics. Because if this case had been covered in a real way, that the media should look at issues of cyber harassment, stalking, violence against women, I don't think these results would have been like that. People would have understood that actually this should not be happening. But the media gave them a weaponized language of like, no, you are a woman who can't stand a man talking to you. Who are you? And then people ran with that. So misogyny came back to really deny a woman who is so brilliant, so who's stand on so many things in our country, policies, was so brilliant, but it was all overshadowed by the fact that a man consistently over months harassed her and she was scared for her life and took a case to court. So it's very important. I would have wanted to hear stories of how do we actually shape these narratives, how do we push back, but also how do we protect these women, you know, so that if this was happening, maybe there were other ways. If we think that going to court is going to have a backlash, what other means would she have had? It's very difficult. So how do we navigate this kind of thing? For me, it would have been the questions. But a great, much greater, I would have wanted to learn around organizing, how other women are organizing, to make sure that the elective politics makes sense. Because a lot of times we have had in our continent, we have more women. We have countries that are all on top of, when you look at data statistics, women representation is higher, but actual power in the hands of women is nowhere, because as long as you're living under a dictatorship and a despot, it doesn't matter how many women you fit into your parliament or your local council. If the power is not shifting, then we are not shifting much. So I would have wanted to hear stories of women, how we can shift that power and not run away only on figures, because numbers are not necessarily power. Power is played differently. And many leaders, especially men who are the dominant in our society, have learned the language of gender equality to use it to their benefit. So they kind of appoint a few women here and there and look good and acquire loans from international partners, acquire accolades at the expense of the women there, and they actually end up really not participating fully. And an example, of course, we have countries like Rwanda, Ethiopia. We have, of course, we have countries that should be doing better, like Kenya, but a parliament that has consistently blocked moves to effect a two-thirds gender rule, where no public body would be allowed to sit with only one gender constituting more than two-thirds, has been blocked consistently. In the Supreme Court has advised a parliament to be dissolved in Kenya because of this very thing. But you would think that Kenya's journey into, even with their challenges, that the question of gender would have been actually a little more higher. So in terms of inclusion of women. But surprisingly, in the region, even in the East African region, they have some of the least representation of women when you look at countries like Rwanda, Uganda. So we still have a long way to go. We have come from far. We have come from women not being at different tables, and we have now some there, but we need to not be complacent. We need to look for newer ways of organizing. I think a lot of, for example, in my country, a lot of organizing in the 90s, in the 80s, led to us having more women in the first parliament. Now we are kind of stuck because we are in a stagnant dictatorship. But how do we actually organize with new movements that are led by young people, which are still very male focused and very male dominated? How do we approach these movements to actually work with them to enable an environment where women can flourish as equals in elective politics? And that's what I would have wanted to hear from everybody. Thank you.